Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Catholicism. Today, I am here once again with Erick Ybarra. Last time, I think we talked about why every Protestant must accept transubstantiation. And then the time before that, we talked about Pope Vigilius. And so today, we're returning to the topic of the papacy again. Erick, it's so great to have you.
Hey, Swan, thank you so much for having me back. It's always a blessing to be here with you.
Well, Erick, as I might have mentioned earlier, what we're talking about today is the papacy and heresy. What
hmm
happens when a pope fails? How low can a pope go? Unintentional rhyming there. And Erick, I wanted to pitch this question to you, but before we get into our discussion today, I know that you have a new course out, I think, on this topic. Well, particularly on Pope Honorius. And so, just tell me more about it and where we can find this course.
Yeah, so Pope Honorius comes up quite a bit in discussions with Protestants and Eastern Orthodox, and even amongst Catholics. So it's not only something that is talked about between Catholics and non-Catholics; it's also almost a debate within
Mm,
within Catholicism. So people who are already are faithful to the magisterium have different views about Honorius.
mm,
So this course that I did is suited to be useful for all three of those people. So
mm.
if you're Orthodox Protestant and you use Honorius as an objection, but also for the internal debates between Catholics. So it's 7 parts.
Mhm.
Each one is about 30 minutes to 45 minutes long. And I wanted to make it short so that way people can consume it in bite sizes. And yeah, it's going to basically take you through the whole, everything you want to know about Pope Honorius, basically.
Mhm.
um, and so you get access that at erickybarra.com. If you look at the top right, you'll see a tab that says courses, and you'll see one course already available for justification by faith. And then the next one underneath that is it's called The Condemnation of Pope Honorius, Dispelling the Myths.
Yeah, one thing I appreciate about your work, Erick, is that you are always careful to not overstate your case and to also admit like when things are awkward for our side or even for other people's side. And so, as you described here, once again, if you go to erickybarra.com/courses, you can see the course on justification and then the condemnation of Pope Honorius, dispelling the myths. And more courses are coming soon. So that's
Yeah,
also exciting, Erick.
yeah.
Well, with that, I'm ready to get into your presentation on the papacy and heresy. And
Okay.
so, just as you're pulling that up for the audience, what I'm going to do is sit back, listen to Eric's presentation, and then afterwards, take notes and ask questions after he's done. But Eric, the floor is yours. Go right ahead.
All right. Thank you, Suan. Yeah, I'll try to go through this as quick as I can because I know before I took up a lot of time in our response to Dr. Gavin Ortland. This is definitely not as many slides as that one. So let's work through the material and then we'll jump right into like the meat of the questions and the discussion. So I'm going to be discussing Liberius, Vigilius, and Honorius. And we're going to quickly touch on Pope Liberius. He died in 366 because Liberius is he's often brought up, but he's not as a significant challenge as the other two. But I do want to bring him up and sort of just quickly rehearse why um, what the history is and why it's not really as relevant to the question at hand. So Pope Liberius, he was taken captive under Emperor Constantius II. That's widely known. He returned from captivity and annulled a semi-Arian creed and condemned Macedonianism. Now, that's important because a lot of people think of Liberius as a heretic who died a heretic. But as far as we know, whenever he was free, in other words, when he came out of captivity, he was thoroughly Nicene and he never showed any signs of retracting or repenting, which is interesting because if he had subscribed to a heretical creed officially, then there would be some history of his recantation, but we don't see any of that. He was like I said, he was a keen defender of Nicene orthodoxy. Some of the contemporary, or I shouldn't say contemporary, but the historians that were chronicling the history shortly after the time of Liberius, they all testified to Liberius as a staunch defender of Nicene orthodoxy. So Theodoret of Cyrus, Rufinus, Socrates, Sozomen, and Athanasius. He was remembered as a saint by Saint Ambrose, Saint Damasus, Saint Siricius, Saint Basil the Great, Theodoret of Cyrus, and Saint Epiphanius of Salamis. And so this is just interesting tidbit here, because not, if you look at the proportion for how many people know that Liberius was a heretic versus how many people realize that he was venerated by saints, you see a vast difference there. But he was remembered as a saint. According to Saint Hilary of Poitiers, Saint Jerome, and Saint Athanasius, he did subscribe to a heretical creed and communed with heretics. So we do have some voices that say this happened, and they were not quick to come to that decision. They did their investigation. In Liberius's letters, which you could read like at the Vatican Library, comes to us in various books you can get online. Cardinal Henry Newman, for example, he looks at the letters of Liberius in his book on the Arians and the history of the Arian crisis. But one can see his capitulation to condemn Athanasius and to comply with the wishes of the emperor. Officially, the creed he signed was not Arian, however. It simply avoided homoousios, but the specific creed that he signed, one of them at least, the Confession of Antioch, that was actually defensible by Saint Hilary, who, Hilary was a very staunch and strict and stern Nicene. And so sometimes the idea is that Liberius signed an outwardly, heretically Arian creed. But that doesn't seem to be the case. The other confession was of Sirmium, which is also ambiguous at worst, obviously avoids homoousios. My book covers the history of Liberius a little further, but this is the basic review. And then I'm just going to give you a quotation from Saint Athanasius. For those of you who want to read the whole thing, you can pause here. I bolded and italicized the most important part. So if you could see there towards the bottom, this is what Athanasius says about Liberius's lapse into error. He says, but Liberius, after he had been in banishment 2 years, gave way, and from fear of threatened death, subscribed. Yet even this only shows their violent conduct and the hatred of Liberius against the heresy, and his support of Athanasius, so long as he was suffered to exercise a free choice. For that which men are forced by torture to do, contrary to their first judgment, ought not to be considered the willing deed of those who are in fear, but rather of their tormentors. So I'm going to stop there, close quote. That's from Athanasius in his History of the Arians, Part 5. You can access this translation at newadvent.org. But what you could see here is that Athanasius was of the mindset that Liberius hated Arianism, semi-Arianism, but because he was in fear of his life, he gave into the will of his tormentors, which Athanasius very charitably takes as not Liberius's own position, but that of his tormentors. And this doesn't get anywhere close to like a freely deliberated act of what we would understand as the Pope's official magisterium. Not even his non-definitive, fallible magisterium. This is just gangsters, running up on the Pope in a private capacity. So that's Liberius. I think it's best to go with Athanasius. He's venerated as a saint by the Oriental Orthodox for goodness sakes. That, you know, they're big on Alexandrian Christology, and Liberius is one of their holy saints. So I think we should go with how the church eventually took him. All right, so we're going to move to Pope Vigilius, which out of all these characters, I think is the most difficult. But I'm going to have to go through the history just real quickly. So after Chalcedon, which dogmatized, you know, the two natures in one person doctrine, there was mass division in the East, especially. Chalcedon was a very hard sell, especially for those Greek speakers and speakers in the Far East, in Syria, some in Palestine and in Egypt. They were of the mindset that Chalcedon was an error, and so by the time of Pope Vigilius's pontificate, you've got this these schisms that are wreaking havoc on the church with relation to Chalcedon. And you know, I mentioned how those who didn't accept Chalcedon, we call them Miaphysites or Miaphysitism, those who hold to the one feces, the one nature of the Lord Jesus incarnate. And this is following the Occasion Schism, which it's relevant to this question of whether Chalcedon is going to remain the standard of orthodoxy. That's really what the question was from 484 all the way into the middle of the 6th century. And one of the key features of that debate was a dossier of documents by three men. It was, you know, known as the Three Chapters. These were writings by Theodore of Mopsuestia, Theodore of Cyrus, and Ibas of Edessa. And these characters had written some Christological statements that were understood by many to be Nestorian in their material. And because of that, because the West tended to see some of these writings as legitimate, especially because Theodoret and Ibas were accepted by the Council of Chalcedon, it was taken up by the Emperor Justinian as a tool to try and bridge the Miaphysites back into communion with Chalcedon if we could get a universal condemnation of the three chapters. So this is where we get the emperor coming in to try and take hold of the affairs of the church. It wasn't new. We already saw that with Constantius II and Pope Liberius. That's going back over 200 years before this, or almost 200 years before this. But we see Justinian taking up this idea of, you know, making an edict to condemn the three chapters, and he foists that upon the church, upon the five patriarchs. And the principal patriarch he needed was obviously the Bishop of Rome. In his own code of civil law, the decrees of the Roman pontiff were absolute and supreme. And so in order to be consistent with his own code, he needed the Bishop of Rome to cooperate with his plan. Problem is, this didn't go as he wished. So at first, Pope Vigilius, being taken away from Rome, brought to Constantinople in order to ensure that this edict was successful. Vigilius has a series of vacillations. He doesn't really know how to address this without the support of an ecumenical council. And eventually he expresses that to the emperor. But initially, he acted in haste and released a document, or his first decree, which is known as the Judicatum, which condemned the three chapters. However, when he did that, many Western bishops thought that he was sacrificing the standard of Chalcedon. In other words, they understood that Chalcedon and at least some parts of the three chapters, or most parts of the three chapters, were basically consubstantial with each other in terms of Orthodox theology. And sort of to condemn the three chapters is also to slice right through Chalcedon. And so because that was the reaction, Pope Vigilius ended up annulling that decree and went through a series of vacillations within Constantinople, the history of which I can't go into great detail here. I'm only going to mention what's pertinent to our subject. The next decree, which he wrote, which is the Constitutum 1 or Constitution 1, wherein he, after careful study of his own, decides to be very meticulous with how he treats the contents of the three chapters. In that first constitution, he concedes to the Greeks that Theodore of Mopsuestia he was a Nestorian through and through. He concedes that the writings of Theodoret of Cyrus that were in the dossier were Nestorian. But he doesn't agree with condemning their persons because for Vigilius, there was no precedent for doing that. People who died were buried and had a requiem mass in the church over 100 years ago shouldn't be disturbed, right? That was his position. But the Greeks and Emperor Justinian, seeing that this was, going to hinder the process of reunion with Miaphysites, they mandated it, and they had their own arguments for it. Sadly, one of them coming from St. Augustine. But Vigilius said, okay, you guys are right about those two on the content of their writings, but we're not going to anathematize them. Then it really turned on the writings of Ibas of Edessa. That is the special character that plays the significant role in this whole question about Vigilius, because Vigilius in this constitution gives what looks like the full weight of papal authority in defending the letter of Ibas as a thoroughly Chalcedonian document. He admits that there's some flaws to it, but he says that ultimately, at the end of the day, what Ibas said here has to be true because the Council of Chalcedon used that letter in order to verify Ibas's orthodoxy. So this is where Vigilius stood on the matter of the three chapters with Constitution number 1. However, the Fifth Ecumenical Council, which convened and proceeded to its first session without the Pope, because the Pope wasn't on board with the whole process, they ended up removing him from the diptychs, calling him a Nestorian because he was defending Ibas's letter. And they went ahead and processed their own anathema against the three chapters under the authority of Emperor Justinian. Well, that meant that Justinian was kind of, Vigilius was kind of stuck. What's he going to do now? So within 6 months, Vigilius turns around in what is one of the most difficult papal reversals to really to understand. He turns around and gives a full-on condemnation of the letter of Ibas of Edessa as a blasphemous heretical document. And so that's really what we're going to be looking at here. So my next slide, I'm going to show you what the first condemnation in Constitution 1, and then we'll look at what he said in Constitution 2. So you'll be able to see how he vacillated, and with what is the quality of the decree. Does it sound like it's authoritative? Does it sound like it's a private opinion? Well, we have it here on page 205 of the second volume of Richard Price's translation of the Acts of Constantinople 553. So this is what Vigilius says in Constitution 1, quote, "We decree and ordain with the authority of our present verdict that, as regards all matters, and in particular the oft-cited letter of the Venerable Ibas, the judgment of the Fathers in session at Chalcedon is to remain inviolate. By this our Constitution, we do not permit anyone with ecclesiastical rank or dignity ever to presume, whether by addition or abridgment or amendment or in any way, to make any rash innovation in the matter of the same letter or in other matters that at the Council of Chalcedon, with the assent of the representatives of the Apostolic See, were resolved, ordained, defined, and decreed as if they were imperfect and open to criticism, close quote. So, I recommend the listeners to pause this and read it a few more times, because it's dense. And what Vigilius is saying here, just plainly in this document, is that Ibas's letter has to be orthodox. We can't condemn it because here's what his basis of thought is. He thinks the Council of Chalcedon defended this letter. And so for him, he's trying to protect the Council of Chalcedon. And so the way he reasons in this decree is that whatever Chalcedon said about the letter of Ibas, that has to remain, because Chalcedon is infallible. So yeah, Vigilius there at the last sentence, as if it were imperfect or open to criticism, which means he thinks that the Council of Chalcedon is perfect and not open to criticism. And because the letter of Ibas fell underneath the acceptance of Chalcedon, well, simply by way of logical deduction, the letter of Ibas also is perfect and not open to criticism. So what you have here is an official decree of the Pope, which was sent out. He addresses the whole church here, and that's clear from the beginning of the letter. And anyone who wants to do further research into that, they could get Price's book. It's a very long constitution, but here he's basically binding the church to view the letter of Ibas as an orthodox document. Okay, which means that anybody who read this decree, they would have the Pope's authority to take Ibas's letter, take it home, study it, copy it, teach it at Bible studies or small group studies, and it would be safe for consumption. Okay, that's what we get from this decree. In his let's see, this is from the same constitution, but he gives a little bit more color to the decree. He says concerning the everything he has said about the 3 chapters, he says, quote, "We enact and decree that no one with ecclesiastical dignity and rank is permitted to hold or write or produce or compose or teach anything about the oft-mentioned 3 chapters contrary to what has been declared and enacted in this present decree, or to raise any further inquiry subsequent to the present definition. But if in the name of anyone with ecclesiastical dignity and rank there has been or will have been done, said, and written by whomsoever and wheresoever it so transpire, anything in breach of what we have declared and enacted concerning these 3 chapters, this we totally annul with the authority of the Apostolic See, over which by the grace of God we preside," close quote. All right, so this is still Constitution 1, but I added this section here to show that he has a sense of definitiveness, finality, where anybody who tries to disagree with it, it's de facto annulled by this decree itself. In other words, this is not a private opinion. It's not, it could be a disciplinary judgment. However, it's related to the orthodoxy of a letter, whether it matches with the correct Christology or if it violates the correct Christology. And this whole letter Vigilius has been arguing that Ebus's letter matches up with correct Christology. And so it is a doctrinal matter, but he is using this as an authoritative decree. Okay, now 6 months later, we have two quotations from Vigilius where he annuls what he previously decreed. So at the top there, this is ad Eutychius. This is to the Patriarch of Constantinople. He says, quote, "But whatever was done by myself or by others in defense of the aforementioned 3 chapters, we annul by the authority of our present letter." Close quote. That's 6 months later. Second quotation there, quote, "We, therefore, anathematize and condemn the aforesaid 3 impious chapters, that is, the letter said to be from Ebus to Marie the Persian, which contained the wicked blasphemies. But whatever is produced or found anywhere, whether under my name or that of anyone else in defense of the aforementioned 3 chapters, we annul by the authority of our present most comprehensive decree." Close quote. So what you have here is basically a turnaround. And Vigilius himself admitted that he made an error. And he appealed to St. Augustine's retractations as a precedent for a holy man in the church to do this. So he wasn't condemning himself in this decree, in this second constitution. In fact, he defends himself. He seems to say that he's always been correct in Christology. It's just he had an oversight when it came to whether Ebus's letter was orthodox. And he came to realize that the letter that Chalcedon was defending was not the letter of Ebus to Marie, but was a letter from the Edessan clergy about the orthodoxy of Ebus. So it was a historical he had a historical fact that was wrong in his mind, and because of that, he ended up applying Chalcedon's infallibility to the wrong letter. And so he fixes that. He makes an adjustment, and he comes out and he says that he annuls his prior decree, which is interesting because that means that even he didn't even see the council as having the authority to annul his first constitution. Do you see? Because remember, this is written 6 months after the council. And here he is saying, we annul by our present letter. So I agree with Father Richard Price in his commentary. Vigilius is not under any impression that like what the Greeks did with the emperor had any authority. Because if he did, then he wouldn't be thinking he had to annul his prior constitution. So he certainly thinks he's still in supreme authority, even while he has to come, on his knees a little bit, admitting that he was wrong. He still doesn't think the council had the authority to do what it did. And at the bottom there, you can see we annul by the authority of our present most comprehensive decree. So Vigilius thinks that his first constitution was it had the potential to be annulled. So what kind of a change did he make in this decree? That's the question that plagues theologians and historians. You've got a lot of people throughout history who took this as a proof that papal infallibility is wrong, because here you have Pope Vigilius telling the whole wide world church that a document is safe to read, perfectly orthodox, and has to be, and that if anybody disagreed with it, his own authoritative decree annuls it. And then 6 months later, he completely reverses and calls the same very document containing wicked blasphemies. So it has to be dealt with. You see, we can't just turn away from it. And a lot of the Catholic defenders of papal absolutism in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, they tended to downplay the Vigilius situation. They kind of said, well, Vigilius, it wasn't a matter of doctrine, it was just a matter of whether it was opportune to condemn dead people. And that's not true. As you can see, it's definitely related to the matter of Christological doctrine. Um, Other people in the past have tried to say that it was not a matter of, an ex cathedra decree. And that's the position I take. I seek to defend. I'm not entirely satisfied with my work in proving that yet. Some people might be surprised to hear me say that. I wrote a whole book on it. How could you say that, Eric? Well, it takes time. Some things just take time. And I think that what I've done so far is sufficient to share. But I do still want to penetrate deeper into this to see if I can defend my view with better evidence. But here's what I would say. To dumb this down a little bit, what is Vigilius doing here? Well, picture a teacher who the teacher has the right understanding of the two natures of Christ, the one person of Christ. Um, his Christological doctrine is good. When he says this is what must be believed, that is 100% correct. But then somebody turns in a paper trying to explain in their own terms and in their own way what Christology is. And this teacher, takes the correct Christology, and then EBUS, that's the correlation I'm making here. The student who submits their document in their own terms and language, and the teacher says, "Well, I know what's right. That's this. That's the standard. When I match this together, it looks like to me they match, and so I'm going to go ahead and grade it as an A plus." But then later on, more facts about that document that was turned in by the student get known that were not known before. And in light of that new knowledge, now the teacher says, "Oh, wait a minute, wait a minute. You meant this by that? You meant this by that? Okay, well, now I've got to revise this. This is actually not a match." Okay, period. Full stop. That's what happened. Okay. So anybody who's confused on this, they've been listening. Well, wait, Eric's going too fast. That's something I've never been told, by the way. Eric's going too fast, but that's aside. That's really what's happening here. Now, some people might say, well, it doesn't matter, Eric, if Vigilius's own standard was correct. What matters is that he put out in and through a magisterial action a letter that was it had heresies in it, as the church would come to finally decide. And so it really doesn't matter how genuine Vigilius's own heart was, doesn't matter how genuine his own mind, doesn't matter how orthodox he was, just by wrecking this grading of the paper, um, he he put an error into the Pope's magisterium, and on a matter related to Nestorianism, which had already been condemned by the Council of Ephesus 431, which by then was put into the dogmatic books of the church. And so it happens to be a doctrine which all Christians have to subscribe to. And so what do you do with that? And so I would say that this is not an ex cathedra decree because the Pope is not defining doctrine. In his own definition of doctrine, he put Ephesus and Chalcedon as the pillars. He was grading Ebas's letter, okay, which is it is a doctrinal judgment, but it's not one where he's saying this is what you must believe. He's saying, no, no, Chalcedon protected this document as orthodox. We must protect it as orthodox. Anybody who doesn't, everything they say is annulled. That seems to be a protective measure in my understanding. It comes short of an ex cathedra decree, but I do have to admit that the material of the first constitution, it had to be annulled. It had to be annulled because it did have errors. It did have errors, and not just errors that were like it wasn't said as well. It could have been said better, and not errors like that, because you can see in the second quotation, he calls it wicked blasphemies. So the character of the errors, quality of the errors, are ones that are going against the Ephesine dogma of Cyril and Pope Celestine. Okay. But I do think that it's not an ex cathedra decree, but what it does prove is that as good of a theologian as Vigilius might have been, just his messing up the grading on Ebas's letter constitutes an error. It just does. It just does. Okay. I want to give a synopsis that I came across in the Irish Ecclesiastical Review back in 1870, actually, and I think this is the most accurate Pope-splaining explanation that I accept. I accept it, and I've read a lot about Vigilius. I've read a lot of Catholic apologetical material that tries to defend our teachings in and through this crisis. But I think this little paragraph here is the best one I've read out of the last 10 years that I've done research on. So I'll just read it. Quote, Vigilius was deceived on a matter of history, for infallibility does not shelter either popes or councils from errors of fact, when these are not essentially connected with doctrine. By his constitutum he decides nothing unless that the decrees of Chalcedon shall have their full effect. And because he is persuaded that Ibas was then declared innocent, he forbids his letter to be condemned. Besides, this letter, as well as the judicatum which he had preceded it, presents by no means the character of a solemn definition in a matter of faith. It is the expression of the Pope's will and an order which he ends the fathers of the council, this order being founded on a false supposition. The bishops consider they need no take account of it. And when, a little later, Vigilius is rightly informed of his mistake, when he sees that the condemnation of the 3 chapters and their authors do not affect the Council of Chalcedon and is not likely to engender the divisions in the West, which were anticipated, himself gives a final decision showing with much prudence that different opinions on the controversy may be entertained, provided due regard he had to the interest of the church, close quote. Now, so this is the best I've come across, but my only criticism here is that line where he says that that this has nothing to do essentially with doctrine, as if it was just purely disciplinary. I want to say that that's not the case, because in the first constitution, Vigilius is going to great lengths showing that Ebas's letter is Chalcedonian, and later on he says as if it was open to criticism or imperfect. So he is saying that Ebas's letter was orthodox, and so it does touch the matter of doctrine. However, the author of this article in the Irish Ecclesiastical Review, which for the life of me, there was none. I didn't see any author, but the references there is at the bottom. I think he comes the closest to saying, well, this was based on a historical error, but I do think it did end up terminating in a doctrinal error, but not one that comes off the Pope's solemn and infallible decree. I just want to give one more view from the scholarship of Roman Catholics on this. This is coming from Father Robert Eno. He says this, quote, modern Roman Catholic judgments of the Vigilius case and of the similar case of Liberius have refused to see in his decisions and statements an exercise of papal infallibility. Even apart from the question of the danger of anachronism in reading the First Vatican Council's conditions for the exercise of papal infallibility back into the distant past, the question of the validity of decisions and statements made under duress is pertinent here. How are we to consider judgments arrived at in an atmosphere of imperial coercion, pressure, and even physical force? In reality, Vigilius had been a prisoner of the emperor for years. The questions debated were a tangle of complex historical and theological issues. Even under these difficult circumstances, Vigilius always insisted that he was not attacking or in any way detracting from Chalcedon. In our eyes, he may be faulted for deviousness, for a lack of courage, and especially for the absence of that steadfastness the ancients had come to expect from the rock of Peter, close quote. So I actually don't agree with Father Eno all the way here, but I wanted to share what he said because he's a prominent Catholic scholar. I should say the late Robert Eno, Father Eno. So yes, I do agree with the first line. It's not an executor decree. That's clear. However, the issue of imperial coercion, if we're going to say that the constitutions of Vigilius were not even to be considered as magisterial or from the Pope, his office, because he was under duress, then we'd have to say the entire council was too, because the entire council was under the under the threat of exile if they didn't comply with Emperor Justinian. Now, if the church today wanted to entertain that, I would be interested to see how that gets executed. But as far as we know, the Fifth Ecumenical Council went into the books as one of the holy and great councils. And so I don't think we could use the duress argument for Vigilius, especially because the first constitution was in opposition to the emperor. It would be different if it was in harmony with the emperor, because then he'd be trying to get out of pain. But because he was going against the emperor, that gives the modicum. It gives off the idea that he was acting with liberty. But otherwise, I think Eno's statements here are definitely considerable. All right, then we're going to go through Honorius. Honorius is not that as difficult as Vigilius. And like I said, I have a course on Honorius. As Suan pointed out, there are forthcoming courses. I do have a course coming out on Vigilius to be determined as with when that will release. But with Honorius, this is a very easy review. There's the controversy over monothelitism, and Sergius of Constantinople reaches out to Pope Honorius, telling Honorius, hey, we've got this theological debate in the East. We got a guy in Jerusalem, we got a guy in Antioch, we got a guy in Alexandria. We're all trying to figure out whether we could say there's one or two energies, one or two operations, or one or two wills in Christ. And Pope Honorius writes 2 letters to Sergius, one of which he says that Christ has one will. But for the most part, he's refraining from judging on the matter. But he's pretty emphatic that Christ has one will. But what he means by that one will is not one will between the two natures, but the one will within the human nature. So I think a plain reading of Honorius's letter shows that that's what he meant. And I wish this controversy never existed. In fact, what a lot of people don't know is that Pope John IV, who was a second successor to Honorius after Honorius, wrote an apologia of Honorius, basically arguing what I just said. Honorius was he was a saint. He had a requiem mass said for him. He died in the very peace of the church, in the arms of the church. He didn't mean what the Greeks mean by monothelitism. He meant something else. Saint Maximus the Confessor also taught the same defense of Honorius. Well, once the Council of Constantinople 681 was convened, we get a completely different reaction to this. Macarius of Antioch, he was defending himself at the council. One of the things he used as a defense of monothelitism, that's what he held, was, hey, Pope Honorius, he's the one I'm following, right? And they're like, what are you talking about? Nobody prepared to examine Honorius at the council. They only prepared to examine Theodore of Ferrand, Sergius of Constantinople, Paul Pyrrhus, and some other characters. So when Macarius brought up Honorius, the council, like just right there, I guess, read the letters and said, oh, he says one will. And so they issue an extremely scathing anathema of Pope Honorius. And the way that comes out is here on the screen. I'm not going to read all of this. For those of you who do want to read it, you get to hit the pause button. I just want to point you to the middle section there, where they don't condemn Honorius for negligence, as if he was, he himself was Orthodox, but he, kind of like somebody who's a watchman at the tall tower, and he just doesn't. He sees the enemy coming and doesn't ring the bell to notify the militia. That's not what they have in mind here. We know that because the material that they look to in order to condemn Honorius are his two letters, which is that's material that was put onto an objective sheet of paper, what he believed or what he taught in those two letters. And they call they say we entirely reject them. On the 6th line, we entirely reject them, the two letters of Honorius, and execrate them as hurtful to the soul. Another Greek translation of this is profane and soul destroying. That's another, hurtful to the soul in one word in the Greek is soul destroying. Execrate, some commentators say by the word execrate that they actually proceeded to burn the letters at the council. I've not been able to confirm that. So you see here there's a litany, there's a catena of anathemas to all the heretics. They put Honorius there in the list. Pope Saint Leo II. This is where this gets fun, because within the circle of Catholics, we tend to say, yeah, okay, the Greeks did that. But when it fell onto the lap of the Pope, he reduced and modified and changed everything they did there and changed it. He still believed that Honorius deserved to be punished, even though this was 40 years after his death. But the punishment is simply for negligence or for being criminally lazy, where he should have been more vigilant. Well, this is what Leo II writes back to the Greeks. Okay, because sometimes we look at the letters of Leo to other Western bishops and say, oh well, it looks like he relaxes the anathema. Well, what really matters is what he said back to the Greeks and the emperor, because that's really what's going into the chief book of the council. He says this: we condemn Honorius, who did not attempt to sanctify this apostolic church with the teaching of apostolic tradition, but by profane treachery permitted its purity to be polluted, close quote. John Chapman, he was one of the foremost Catholic apologists of the papacy at the end of the 20th century, or at the end of the 19th century, going into the 20th century. He said that this actually goes further than the Greeks, because the Greeks were just talking about Honorius in his letters, but Pope Leo II actually says that it actually touched the Roman See. because he talks here, he says that he did not sanctify this apostolic church. What's he talking about? He's talking about Rome, right? He did not sanctify it. Okay, so if he did not sanctify it, did he just make it neutral? No. He says by profane treachery permitted its purity to actually get pollution, a stain to its immaculate status. Now, that's further than the council, because the council, sometimes people could read the council and say, well, they are only judging him in a private capacity. But Leo II is going so far as to this touching the papal throne itself, and so this it does make things a bit interesting. Then I'm going to show on the screen here some of the statements of the Seventh Ecumenical Council, where they condemned Honorius again, really just rehearsing, but you'll see there the way they understood Honorius. It wasn't by negligence or anything. You look in the red letters at the very bottom, who shared their beliefs. In other words, Honorius is being put in a catalog of people who had false beliefs. At the Council of Constantinople 869, 870, you'll also see at the bottom there, they put Honorius into a catalog of false teachers that are talking about their false teachings. And so no care or consideration was taken to try and say, well, wait a minute, Honorius wasn't teaching error. His anathema was of a different kind. No kind, and all sane and rational psychology would have it that if these men in all these councils were if they were under the impression we can't ever give the idea that the Pope taught heresy or error, that they would not specify that. They would not qualify that. Okay. It just goes against all plain sense for them not to do that, and for them to just keep adding him into these lists of false teachers. All right. So the last thing I want to say here is that despite all of this with Vigilius and Honorius, the papacy continued to be consulted. It continued to be refer to itself as the supreme authoritative tribunal in doctrinal debates. Saint Theodore, the Studite monk in the 9th century, he says something very interesting. He says, quote, since Christ our God has granted to the great Peter, in addition to the keys of the kingdom of heaven, the dignity of being the first primate among pastors, it is necessary to report to Peter or his successor everything new that has been introduced in the Catholic Church by those deviating from the truth. And this is the important line I want the readers, the listeners to see. Thus, having learned to do this from our ancient holy fathers, we too, the most humble and lowly of all, in view of the innovation introduced to our church, that's iconoclasm, consider it our duty to report this to the angel of your supreme beatitude in our humble letter, close quote. All right, so here's Theodore the Studite, who nobody's going to accuse of being a lightweight theologically. He says what he has learned from the ancient holy fathers is the papacy. We're going right back to what Christ created, what's in Peter, supreme authority, and to Peter's successor, which is interesting because what you might think is, wait a minute, Theodore, wait a minute. You have Vigilius, right? You got Liberius, you got Honorius. Yeah, Bishop of Rome is just like everybody else. And yet we don't see that. What we see is consistently the opposite. To try and use Honorius, Vigilius, and Liberius, as difficult as especially Vigilius might be, trying to use them as a way to refute the papacy in a very strange way is akin to trying to take a wet noodle against a U.S. Navy warship. It's the material is just climbing and growing and continuing in the papacy, in the direction of the papacy. So whatever has been said hitherto on these matters, um, the papacy was building right alongside. And I think it was left to theologians to how to figure out how to reconcile all this. And I think we did a great job of doing that at Vatican I. But I think we still got work to do on trying to figure all this stuff out. All right, that's it. So
Yeah, well, Eric, thank you for your presentation. How about we work backwards through Honorius, and then I'll get into Vigilius. And I have one connection or question on Liberius, but it's connected to Vigilius. So
yeah,
let me just start with Honorius. So um, it sounds like to me in your presentation, the way that you were going to deal with the problem of Honorius, I mean, the fact that you have multiple documentation of ecumenical councils repeatedly condemning him, is that at the same time, though, you had Agatho, you had Hadrian, and you cited the Studite, Theodore the Studite, to support your position.
Maximus the Confessor. Yeah.
Maximus the Confessor. Um, is the I mean, do you have a specific solution to how to make sense of that, or are you just saying it somehow has to make sense that you can have these two together, or is
Well,
it
I
both?
yeah. So
Yeah.
so in my understanding, I think that and I appeal here to Robert Bellarmine. I appeal to several Catholic apologists going back to the 16th century, um, Hergenrother in the late 19th century, that the council got this wrong. There was a matter of
Mm,
fact. You know,
I
the
see.
council got it wrong, and the Pope Leo II got it wrong. Um, I don't know why he did not look to the Chancery to find Pope John IV's letter defending Honorius, which to me completely satisfies Honorius from, in other words, it exonerates him.
Mhm.
So I think that Honorius's two letters don't deserve the treatment that it got. However, what this does show us is that the official church, even if they did make an error in judgment, they were completely open
Right.
for the 600s, 700s, 800s. So at least for 300 years, and no annulment or revision to that has ever been done, according to my knowledge.
Mhm.
So for throughout these three or four ecumenical councils and five papal decrees from Leo II, they were open to one of the occupants of the papal throne teaching heresy.
Right.
That's how they understood it. That's the easiest way to read the data. They don't have any asterisks or qualifications or anything like that. That just seems to be what they were open to accept. Um, why they didn't take the time and say, wait a minute, but how does this reconcile with what else we've said? It's slightly bizarre. I don't want to impugn the reputation of holy people,
Mhm.
but today I would say it would almost be like a malfeasance to just let these tensions remain.
Right.
Um, so to me, I think Honorius is completely free of heresy.
Mm.
But what the history does show us is that the church was open to this possibility, and they thought it was an actuality.
Mm.
See, so I think that that plays a factor in today's debates
Sure.
because now if the church came out and said, "Oh man, we forgot to deal with this," yeah, Honorius is Maximus was right, John the Fourth was right. Yeah, no, he was not. If the church did that, I'd be very happy to see that, but the what sits on the books right now is everything I put out here, and it's unfortunate, but that's what it says.
Mhm. So then, somebody might say, well, I guess given the fact that the council had this error in fact, um, could you use that also to deal with the Vigilius situation then? Because also there was an error in fact on what he thought was, well, let me just go into the Vigilius question then. So I wanted to ask you to clarify on a certain point. So was the problem that Vigilius had actually misinterpreted the right letter that was being condemned, or was it that he was thinking of one letter when it was supposed to be another letter?
No, he it was kind of both. So
Okay.
he read a document by Ebos that talked about Jesus, and in it there were accusations that it was Nestorian.
Right.
But he was reasoning differently. He's like, well, I don't see Nestorianism in this. So the error he had was both a fact and doctrine. So I guess what we could say is the Council of Constantinople that took Honorius's two letters and read it as monothelite, it's
Mm,
not just an error in fact, it's also an error in interpretation, you
right.
know, but not this is what's true. It's this doesn't match to it, or this does match to it. I don't know if that distinction is clear enough, but
Hmm.
their definitive formula for what's true was right. But
Right.
when they started to compare it and contrast it with what other people were saying, they were not. I don't think they got it right with Honorius's intention.
Hmm.
Does that make? I don't know if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, because it sounds like to me what you're saying is that whenever the church, I suppose, directly deals with something of like what is in the apostolic deposit, what did the apostles
Yes.
actually historically teach and receive from Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit and God the Father, they're going to get that right.
That's divine revelation. Yeah. Yeah.
Right, when they have the measuring stick and they say this is what the measuring stick is, they're going to get
Right.
it right. But then when they start measuring things against that measuring stick and using their judgment to, judge if something, like you use the example of grading a paper, then they
Yes.
might not be divinely protected there when they're testing things against the rule, against the measure, against the deposit. Does that make sense?
Yes. That perfectly sums up what what I'm seeing.
Mm-hmm.
And if somebody can tell me, well, Eric, that's not possible, I'd love to hear it. But so far in my research, there's the church has never like said that that's impossible.
Right.
Um, yeah,
I mean, and as you were talking, I literally just thought about, like, St. Peter in Matthew 16, when God the
right,
Father reveals to him that Jesus is the Christ, but then Peter doesn't realize that the cross is part of
right,
Jesus being the Christ. So it's
right,
like in the same moment that Peter got exactly the nature and identity and confession of Jesus correct, he improperly then tried to think, oh, well, then he's not going to die on a cross. He's going to, establish the kingdom in Jerusalem and all that and so forth. So at the same moment that you had, I mean, I would argue an instance of papal infallibility,
right.
you had a moment in which Peter then extrapolated from that and went
False
beyond.
messianism. Yeah,
Right, right, right. And so, I mean, um, I guess when you were talking, that came up, and so I thought, well, I mean, I
it's a
think
good point.
we're in good company with Saint Peter.
Right. Yeah, very good point.
um, So you mentioned how you aren't totally satisfied with your defense on the issue of Vigilius. You said that at least what you presented is sufficient to deal with the problem. What do you still find yourself being unsatisfied about?
Yeah. So, you know, and I was talking to somebody recently about this because it was actually an Eastern Orthodox friend of mine. And he was saying, Eric, it's an ex cathedra decree.
Mm,
Wake up. He's
mm,
teaching, he's making a decree to the entire church. We decree, we enact, everything's in there. And by the authority of this present decree, we can't second judge, we can't question this document because Chalcedon's infallibility protects it. How is that not defining that Ebos's letter is safe for the church, safe for consumption, can be taught, and it's relevant to say that because in North Africa, it happened to be a document that they were reading as safe for consumption.
mm,
Um, and so I feel the weight of that objection, and so that's why I'm still, trying to, figure out is, well, it seems to me that like Vigilius was clearly Chalcedonian. I mean, in and throughout the whole document, he's referring to Pope Leo the Great, Pope Gelasius, Cyril of Alexandria. I mean, there's no question in my mind that he himself formally was attached to the church's correct dogma. Um, but in papal infallibility, he's supposed to be protected from error, you know, that's quite apart, that, it's separate from his own, you know, the material of heresy, for example. If that can't even come up in an ex cathedra decree, because it's supposed to be protected from error and faith and morals altogether.
Mm.
Um, so it's one of those. It's a little bit of a Rubik's cube for me, and I think that I'm safe in saying that if this was an instance of papal heresy, um, why doesn't anybody remember it? I see in the 6th century, the 7th century, 8th century, nobody's bringing up Vigilius, and if it had that much potency, I think it would have been like more noticeable.
Mm.
And so I think that Vigilius just, said, oh, if that was a mistake, and I'm going to annul that decree, and I'm going to issue another one. Um, I do think that it was an error. I mean, he's going to call it a wicked blasphemy in his final constitution. That means he thinks it's a dangerous document.
Right. Right.
So he does show remorse over that. Um, but he doesn't think, well, I just proved I don't have any authority, so what am I going to pretend like I can annul it and then reestablish another decree? He still thinks he's suited to do that. So I think that the wording is lacking the precision that an ex cathedra decree would have. This is what must be believed.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think Ebos's letter I don't think that that was the intention of the Pope. The intention of the Pope was simply to put a shield over Ebos's letter, because
Mm-hmm.
he thought that by attacking it, Chalcedon was going to be attacked.
Mm.
And so I think the nature of the decrees also, um, besides ex cathedra.
Yeah, and if I could maybe just ask two more questions. One is that, I mean, for an Orthodox person who would raise this objection to us on Vigilius, I wonder like what would happen if we tried to reverse another objection. So with Honorius, and how at least you would argue that he was in fact, Orthodox and held the correct Christology. But then the councils just repeatedly condemned him. And I think the position that you articulated was that the councils were wrong in thinking that he was a heretic. But I mean, these are the councils, right? So
Right,
what do you do with
exactly.
that?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I
It's
mean,
it's yeah. Well, I think we could look at this. If I'm dealing with the Orthodox, is
mhm.
the Sixth Councils, it condemned Honorius,
Yeah.
his letters, and anybody who defended his letters. Well, Maximus the Confessor defended the letters of
Mm.
Honorius.
Wow.
So where does that put Maximus? No Orthodox person is going to say Maximus was a heretic. So then they start coming in with well, he read Honorius in a way that was right. So they bring their own pets of reconciliation of what kind of an error did Maximus fall into when
Sure.
he did that? Was it like obviously it was an error in the eyes of the Sixth Council, but it's certainly not one that would make Maximus a heretic. But see, that's not really as relevant to the issue of papal infallibility, because a pope could falsify papal infallibility while not being a formal heretic. Do you see?
Mm.
He just needs to put the material in there.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
So literally, a pope could be formally orthodox, in his otherwise sane mind, but make a mistake in an ex cathedra decree
Right.
just materially, and that would be enough to falsify papal infallibility. So the Maximus analogy it doesn't get us out of the woods, but
Mm.
what I hope it does is it shows that, yeah, we should consider that when somebody has the correct theology and they're mismatching in their comparisons
Right.
with who's holding to it, perhaps that's another frequency, rather than like definitive ecclesiastical
Mm-hmm.
definitions.
Yeah, I'll just make a comment and then get into my last question. But like I definitely think that I definitely think that the example that we brought up of Saint Peter, I mean, to me, actually, personally, I find it very satisfying for at least the problem at hand.
Yeah, I mean, Peter
Um,
was wrong. I mean, yeah.
mhm. It's like, in one instance, he got the identity and his Christology perfectly right. And then in the next instance, he got it wrong. But it seems like in the first instance, he was, directly divinely guided by God. In the next instance, he was extrapolating from that what he was expecting Jesus to do ultimately in his ministry. And so, yeah,
Yeah, I could, I mean, maybe what, like an Orthodox or a Protestant
sure.
might say is, well, when Peter told Peter, I mean, when Peter told our Lord that, far be it that this happened, however, I forget the exact words that he said.
Hmm.
That was, it wasn't Peter like teaching anything. So,
Sure.
so like when we're putting the Vigilius study and the Honorius study into view, we're talking about an active magisterium.
Hmm.
And so they could try to find a dissimilarity in that regard. Um, but, I think that I think, I mean, to put a bottom line in it, I think that the history shows us that a pope could at least err in his magisterium,
Hmm.
and it was understood, at least at the time, that that could be of the grade of heresy.
Mm.
And so that I wish I could avoid that conclusion,
Right.
but it seems to be that that's there from the data, unless, of course, the church comes forward and treats it differently.
Mm.
Church has never touched the matter. Um, I mean, they did, but they touched it in a way that we present it, and
Right.
it's not that it's not open to revision or anything like that. Um, but I when I read the First Vatican Council, what I see them doing is they're trying to limit the conditions of infallibility to definitions on faith and morals, and this is more in line with this is what must be believed.
Hmm.
um, Now, somebody might say, well, Erick, Vigilius was saying that Ebus's letter must be believed as without error, as free of all errors. That's what he said, Erick. He did, but the way in which, first of all, I don't see any excommunications being issued. I don't know if that I didn't make that clear. Uh, all Vigilius said was that if anybody went against it, their efforts would be annulled.
Hmm.
He didn't say that they would be excommunicated. Now, somebody might say, well, it's implied by it. Yeah, but an ex cathedra decree is supposed to make something like that clear, that it's
Hmm.
required for faith and morals. Um,
Right.
and somebody could say, well, he did make it required for faith and morals because he made it consubstantial with Chalcedon. How much more, how much more clear on that can you be? Well, I think that today we would say that our view of Chalcedon doesn't necessarily have to be of the view that Vigilius had, because Vigilius thought everything was infallible at Chalcedon. And no Catholic theologian has held that for centuries. So Catholic theologians are, very specific today to tell you that not everything in an ecumenical council is infallible.
Hmm.
So when the 10th and the 14th session of Chalcedon collected the documents about Ebus, that's not infallible. And so what Vigilius was protecting there wasn't even, um, it was unnecessary to do, because that even Chalcedon's infallibility is only in its definition,
Mm.
you see.
Yeah.
So I think
Hmm.
if we could just use that qualification and I think get out of the situation with Vigilius. And like I said, I think what also helps is that where Orthodox and Protestants would gravitate towards this as a way to say, see, it's patriarchal consensus or democratic vote. No, the church, Vigilius is still working off of the idea of papal supremacy.
Hmm.
The successors of Vigilius are still working off of that. Maximus the Confessor, who's operating in the next century, um, he's he's under no impression that the Vigilius event sort of deactivated this divine promise in the Roman pontiff. He's still and who's going to accuse Maximus of not knowing what happened at that council? So Maximus is still thinking that way. The Council of Lateran 649 still thinking that way. And then the Council of 681, you got the letter of Pope Agatho, shows no signs of recognition that Vigilius was a heretic. So those things
Hmm.
might sound irrelevant, but it's not.
Right.
Because if this is supposed to have the ripple that we are told it's supposed to have, well, why did all these Orthodox saints not feel the ripple?
Mm.
Do you see what I'm saying? It's not
Right. No,
it's
yeah.
not as irrelevant as somebody might initially see it.
Right. The history of interpretation is also very important because, I mean,
Yes.
if people weren't seeing this massive impact and they're closer to the event than we are, then at least that
Right.
should give us pause to not just think we can
Exactly.
jump in from the 21st century and go
Right.
back into the text and just see, oh, this is what it means in this abstract milieu in which I'm reading it from.
Yeah.
Um, and maybe just a few comments here, really quick. Sorry, I know that you might be a little tired, Eric, but I
No,
mean,
no, no, guys.
okay. I mean, I think one thing I'll say though is that with the Vigilius event, I think this is the point where our distinctions become the most fine. They
Yeah.
become the most kind of like cutting the cheese thin, so to
Sure.
speak. And we have to be very careful.
Yeah.
Um,
Hold on, Suan. Let me just get my charger plugged in. Can I pause for a second?
yeah, sure,
Just
of
to get
course.
okay.
So I don't personally like see the Vigilius event as something that's going to keep me up at night. But
Right.
I do see it as a point where it's like, okay, yeah, the distinction gets very fine, but I still think it can be maintained, if
Right.
that makes sense. But I do want to maybe use like an analogy here and maybe get your thoughts on it. And then I'll get into my last question about Liberius and Vigilius. This kind of reminds me, you had a quote by was it Hans von Balthasar in
Yeah.
his book on the chair, something like Chair of Peter in the church,
Yep.
and he talks about there are times, of course, throughout history when there like in what we've talked about popes who get down to the bare minimum of what Vatican I teaches, and I suppose it reminds me of you know imagine that you're in an airplane and you're guaranteed that the pilot is not going to crash the plane and it's not going to burn and and end horribly, right? The Pope's not going to destroy the church by permanently binding it to heresy. But I mean, this pilot is doing crazy flips and turns. You feel nauseous. It's not a great ride. I'm sure that just saying that, oh well, the pilot's not going to destroy the plane doesn't make you want to
Right.
stay on that plane either, or even go on it in the first place. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's good because I think it's good because look, you know, sometimes in our rationalizations, we can pre-engineer our expectations in ways that God has no interest in. So,
Mm,
for example, would anybody have engineered the story of Israel the way it went?
hmm,
No, I don't think so. And yet, the infallibility of the Abrahamic oath stays intact. I mean, throughout the very beginnings, it was as rough ride. I mean, Abram's old, for goodness sake. Every scientific person would have told him, "You're nuts. You're irrational to have this belief." All the way to this captivity in Egypt. Like, what are they doing there for so long? And then why is Moses being the one being used? And then the plagues, and then the Red Sea, and then the 40 years in the wilderness, and then the exile. It's like this promise doesn't seem to be like it's not what you'd sign up for. Imagine if you were to sign up for a God. and one of the
Mhm.
offers was, this is what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And and we're going to throw a little bit of a Job book in there.
Hmm.
It does. In other words, sometimes our expectations are pre-engineered in such a way that the God of heaven, our God, has no interest in. So sometimes people reason this way. Um, well, if the papal protection is supposed to help the church, then, and it's only in ex cathedra or in serious decrees, then that means that it could be like totally tossing in the waves for every other moment and minute outside of that. And so they say, well, it's the protection's got to be more extensive and more
Right.
definitive than that.
Mm.
And of course, that's rational. Of course, I mean, that's how all of us think. I mean, when you're looking for a cardiologist, you're looking for one that's not just going to help you in like the like like a bare prescription aspect. Otherwise, he make your heart enlarge in cardiomyopathy or something. Um, but here's the thing. An immoral pope
Mm.
is also hurtful to the church. A publicly immoral pope is hurtful to the church. It would hurt many people to see something like that. It would prevent people from becoming Catholic.
Yeah.
And yet we don't have a doctrine that says the popes are all have to be saints in order to preserve the credibility of the church, do you see?
Hmm.
So we all still admit, yep, the Pope has a capacity to sin like everybody else. And so I think that sometimes God is interested in seeing his promise put under a possible test, like
Mm.
as if it is going to fail, you see.
Mm.
Um, that seems to be what's going on with, for example, with the uh, uh, Abraham being an old man and Sarah being an old, and then Hagar, attempting to, get the promise of God through human works, and God pushes it all the way to the point of unbelievability,
Right.
and then He protects His word.
Mm. Mm.
So I don't want to make a complete parallel,
Sure.
but what I'm trying to say is that your analogy is apt, and it's actually more appropriate when we're dealing with the God of Israel.
Mm.
And sometimes our pre-engineered, well, if the Pope's the center of the church, then he's got to be like another walking sheet of scripture, always helpful, always doing the right thing, always reliable. Otherwise, the whole thing comes down. Like that might be what humans would want it
Yeah.
to be. I certainly would love that to be the case.
Hmm.
Um, but God just doesn't have a history of, you know, accommodating our expectations.
Right.
So,
Well, Eric, my last question is about Liberius, and you mentioned basically how Liberius was under duress when he was seen kind of, I guess, confirming, if I'm not mistaken, these heretical documents and being with heretics. So you used a duress defense for Liberius, but then you didn't think that the duress defense would work for Vigilius. And I'm wondering, why do you think it works in Liberius's case but not Vigilius's case?
well, so I only used the duress situation because Athanasius did.
I see.
So I'm kind of hanging my hat on Athanasius there. Um, do I think that the Fifth Council and Vigilius were operating under duress? I do. But
Okay.
the difference is all the councils, I mean, almost all the councils were had some sort of duress. I mean, think about it. Once you have the imperialization, or I should say the Christianization of the empire, is
Yeah.
what I should say,
Hmm.
um, then you know what's going to happen if you go against the council.
Hmm.
So it must have been most bishops already understood that for them to go home and put their feet up and have a nice meal, that they'd had to agree with what the council and what the emperor was deciding. So I, but the Fifth Council and Vigilius's constitutions were all collected as part of the Holy and Great Fifth Ecumenical Council.
Mm.
And so because of that, it deters me away from saying that the duress element um, erases the validity of those decrees. Whereas the duress situation with Liberius may have been more extensive because his signature of a creed is not an official magisterium, you
Mm.
know. It was, and the other thing is Vigilius wasn't as Vigilius had nice quarters in Constantinople. He was still respected with a nice place to be. Um, sure, he was put under, some violent pressure, but it seems to me like Constantius II had a whole. It was his program was much more harsh, and he was in danger of like death. Whereas Vigilius showed he was willing to jab back at
Mhm.
um, Justinian.
Mm.
So a guy, Athanasius is saying Liberius is just going along with he's playing the puppet under threat of death, whereas Vigilius is showing signs of no, I'm not going to go along with you. I'm going to say this,
Right.
and just Justinian's not
Mm.
putting him under the gallows.
Mm.
He's giving him nice food, nice place to be. He just really wants the Pope to sign. So I think that the amount of the duress is probably making a difference there.
I see
And
what you're
then,
saying.
and
Mhm.
then also the fact that the fifth, nobody questions the Fifth Council. Because I mean, if we're going to say, well, duress completely invalidates that council, what then do we do with all these centuries of accepting that council?
Mhm.
I don't know.
Right. So yeah, you don't want to say that just duress of any kind is going to nullify a council, or there
Right.
goes there
Yeah,
goes the church.
exactly. Yeah.
All
Yeah.
right. Well, Eric, I appreciate you spending some time in your night to talk to me about papal failure throughout history, and what we do as Catholics with it, and even what Orthodox and Protestants should or shouldn't do with it. Uh, Eric, is there anything you want to add before I end today's episode?
No, just Ybarra.com was not an oft visit website, but it's now my main website.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of people who are wanting to see what I'm doing now and things I'm putting out, that will be the site to go to. Although I'll still have, the in my small encyclopedia that I put on WordPress since 2015, I think that'll still be up. But if you want to see the Honorius course, like we said at the beginning, courses on ericybarra.com. And if you have any questions or anything like that, feel free to reach me on Facebook is really probably the easiest way right now.